The sun sat low over Silver Ridge, its late afternoon light turning dust to gold, catching on every ridge and wrinkle in the trampled dirt. Trucks sat parked in a jagged row, windshields streaked, tires half sunk into the ground, while the hum of nervous voices rose and fell around the makeshift auction ring. The scent in the air was sharp: sweat, hay, leather, the metallic tang of anticipation, and through it all, a sense of doubt pressed down heavier than the heat itself. At the edge of this fray stood Clara Monroe, barely 12, slight and still, pressed back against the cool shadow of a rusted panel fence. Most folks barely noticed her. She had mastered the art of silence, of shrinking into corners, of letting her brown hair fall across her face like a curtain. If she felt anything, she rarely showed it. If she hoped for anything, she didn't say. But her eyes, gray and deep as river stones, missed nothing. Beneath the auctioneer's stand, the stock moved through, in restless waves. Cows lowing, a couple of sleepy ponies, a string of lean mules. Then came the horse everyone whispered about all week. Lot 67, a black stallion, muscle rippling under a coat so dark it seemed to drink the light. His mane, tangled and wild, whipped in the wind as he lunged against the lead rope, whites of his eyes showing. Along his flank, burned into the hide, was a crude brand, a lightning bolt. Next to it, an ugly scar, healed thick and pale. He's dangerous. Damn near killed a man last month. Heard he's untouchable? That horse should have gone straight to the glue factory. The voices circled, rising and falling like the dust. The handler, a man built broad as a barn door, yanked the rope, trying to bring the stallion into line. The animal reared, hooves flashing, a gasp went up. One kid yelped and ducked behind his mother. The auctioneer, voice cracking, tried to regain control, but the crowd was hungry for a spectacle now. Laughter, nervous and sharp, cut through the tension. Clara watched it all from her post at the fence. She could see it in the stallion's eyes. Terror, not rage. Memories flickered in her mind. Shouting, slamming doors, her father's fists pounding the table. She remembered how it felt to be cornered, helpless, waiting for the next blow. Her fingers closed around the old silver flute in her backpack, the one thing her mother left behind before she vanished years ago. The flute was the only thing Clara ever trusted to hold her secrets. As the handler's patience snapped, the stallion surged sideways, nearly breaking loose. A ripple of chaos, a flurry of curses. Someone called for the auction to move on. No one, it seemed, wanted to be responsible for a beast branded as trouble. The stallion's sides heaved. Foam streaked his chest. Eyes wild, he spun, nostrils flaring, legs trembling as if caught between fight and flight. Then, like a stone dropping into water, Clara stepped forward, not rushed, not slow, just with a kind of quiet certainty. She slipped beneath the auction ring rail, her boots barely raising a whisper from the dirt. Heads turned, someone barked, "Hey, girl, get back!" But she didn't stop. In the space between her and the horse, the world shrank. The jeers softened, faded. The handler's voice, angry and afraid, seemed far away. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out her flute. The silver gleamed in the late sun. She brought it to her lips, breath shaking but steady, and began to play. The first notes floated out, soft, uncertain, like the distant memory of a lullaby. Not a song to command or tame, just a simple melody her mother used to hum in kitchens late at night. The stallion's ears flicked back, then forward, his head rising, nostrils stilling. He stomped once, twice, but didn't rear. His gaze locked on Clara, not on the rope, not on the men, not on the fear. Clara played on, letting the tune wander and stretch, pouring into it every ache she carried, loss, longing, the weight of nights spent listening to storms while pretending not to cry. The crowd fell silent. Even the auctioneer seemed at a loss, watching this scrap of a girl face down the animal no grown man dared approach. Something shifted. The stallion's muscles unclenched just a little. His breath slowed. Clara took a step closer, never breaking the rhythm. The handler tried to grab her arm. She shrugged him off without looking, flute still pressed to her mouth. The music was the only thing between her and disaster, and she trusted it more than any hand. One more step, then another. The stallion lowered his head, inch by inch, the wildness in his eyes fading to confusion, then something almost like hope. Clara kept playing, steady as sunrise. She didn't reach for him. She just let the music fill the space where fear had lived. At last the stallion nudged the rope with his nose. Clara knelt in the dirt, flute falling silent. The black horse stood before her, head bent low. She met his gaze, calm, unafraid. For a long moment nothing moved. Then the horse took a breath so deep it rattled through his ribs, and Clara, still on her knees, simply breathed with him. A sound like a prayer went through the crowd, astonishment, disbelief. Someone muttered. She didn't break the horse. She reminded him he wasn't alone. And in that fragile peace, as dust spilled across the ring, Clara Monroe and the stallion named Midnight stood together. Two creatures the world had nearly given up on, finding in each other a place to begin again. Night crept up on Silver Ridge as Aunt Lydia's battered pickup rumbled away from the auction grounds, carrying Clara and the black stallion into the uncertain dark. The trailer rocked and clanked on every bump. Inside, Midnight stood tense, hooves planted, as if the world might lurch again. At any moment, the highway stretched ahead, 2 lanes of cracked blacktop running through endless fields of dust and dry grass. Clara rode up front, silent, hands folded tight in her lap. She glanced at her aunt, whose face was drawn with worry and a kind of stubborn pride. "You sure you're ready for this?" Lydia asked, not for the first time that night. Clara nodded. "He just needs time, that's all." Lydia sighed, eyes softening, and turned back to the road. The Monroe farm sat on the far edge of town, where fences leaned and wildflowers grew up through rusted plow blades. It wasn't much, a sagging barn, a crooked porch, a field that hadn't seen a good harvest in years. But to Clara, it was the only place that ever felt safe. When they arrived, Midnight refused to step out of the trailer. He snorted, pawed the metal floor, and backed as far as space allowed. Clara waited, her boots scuffing the dewy grass, letting the night sounds wash over them. Tree frogs sang, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped. She remembered the words her mother once whispered on stormy nights. "Never rush a scared soul, Clara. Just give them room to breathe." So she waited, whispering nothing, her hands visible, her posture easy. Lydia offered carrots. Midnight ignored them. It wasn't until Clara pulled out her flute and played the same soft tune from the auction that Midnight, nostrils flaring, finally crept down the ramp. He stayed close to the trailer, muscles taut, eyes flickering to every shadow. The next morning dawned cool and pale, dew beating on every blade of grass. Clara found Midnight by the fence, sides heaving, sweat still matting his coat from a night spent pacing. He had not eaten. The barn door, left open, was untouched. Aunt Lydia shook her head, voice low. "That horse is broken, Clara. Not sure anyone can fix him." But Clara saw something else. A survivor, fierce and raw, unwilling to give himself to anyone or anything. She felt the echo of her own story there. Clara knew what it was to flinch at footsteps, to see danger in every hand that reached out, even the gentle ones. Midnight refused all the usual comforts. If Clara tried to lead him, he bolted, nearly breaking her grip on the rope. If she left a halter on, he twisted and pawed at it until it snapped. When the wind shifted, he would freeze, legs stiff, breath shallow, as if some invisible ghost stalked the yard. At night, he circled the field, never settling, always scanning the darkness for threats only he could see. Most kids would have given up or called for a real trainer, not Clara. She changed her approach, remembering her own desperate need for quiet when her father's rage used to fill their old house. Instead of forcing contact, she began her days sitting by the pasture fence, reading aloud from whatever book she found on the porch, a tattered novel, an old collection of poems, sometimes just the newspaper. Her voice was soft, steady, more for herself than for anyone else. Sometimes she'd settle by the creek that split the back pasture, flute balanced on her knees. She'd play until the sun dipped behind the hills. letting the music drift across the water and never looking directly at Midnight. It became a kind of ritual. Clara's presence, gentle and patient, filling the air with stories and melodies. For days, Midnight stayed at the far edge of the field, grazing alone. But Clara noticed how his ears always tilted toward her, how his head would lift when her flute sang. A week passed before he wandered closer, cautious as a stray cat. He'd stop a dozen paces away, head high, eyes wary. If Clara moved too quickly, he'd dart off, so she learned to make every gesture slow and deliberate. Sometimes Lydia watched from the kitchen window, worry etched into her brow. "You can't fix everything with kindness, Clara," she'd say. But Clara kept at it, convinced that trust wasn't something you forced, it was something you waited for. Gradually, Midnight began to linger. One afternoon, as Clara read about distant lands and brave explorers, the stallion grazed within arm's reach. She felt his breath stir the pages, heard the way his hooves muffled softly in the grass. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged with possibility. In that quiet, Clara found a strange sense of peace. A feeling she'd almost forgotten was possible. But progress was never linear. There were setbacks. A sudden noise would send Midnight skittering across the field, eyes wild. He tore down a section of fence one night, trying to escape the flash of distant lightning. Clara found him at dawn, coat slick with sweat, sides streaked with mud. She sat beside him, wordless, until his trembling eased. At school, the other kids asked questions. "You really take home that killer horse? Bet he bites your hand off before summer's out." Clara just shrugged, keeping her secrets close. She'd learned long ago not to trust people with what mattered most. But word got around. Old Mr. Jensen, the neighbor, dropped by with a sack of oats and a wary smile. "Never seen a horse like that calm down before," he admitted. Aunt Lydia was less convinced, but she kept her doubts to herself, busying her hands with chores and pretending not to worry. One evening, as dusk pooled blue and deep around the fields, Clara sat by the creek, flute cradled in her lap. Midnight approached, drawn by habit now. She played a gentle, lilting song, her fingers moving by memory. For the first time, Midnight didn't stop at the usual distance. Instead, he stepped close, so close that Clara could see the scar beneath his mane, could feel the warmth of his breath on her arm. She froze, heart thumping, letting the music carry her fear away. Midnight reached out, tentative, and nuzzled the end of the flute. Clara didn't move, hardly dared to breathe. After a long moment, the stallion grazed beside her, close enough for her to feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. By the time stars emerged overhead, Clara knew something had shifted. Midnight had not become tame overnight. He still spooked, still bolted at sharp sounds, but he no longer saw her as a threat. She had earned, in the patient language of survivors, the first fragile strands of trust. It was a start, not just for Midnight, but for Clara too. In the broken silences and small steps, both learned what it meant to begin again. Nights on the Monroe farm had a silence that was never quite empty. Crickets sawed through the darkness, and the creek's low murmurs wandered through the trees. But when Clara lay in her narrow bed under the window, it was her own heartbeat she heard most clearly. On these nights, the echoes came, memories sharp as glass, slicing through her attempts at sleep. Clara had never told anyone everything, how her father's voice could fill a house like a thunderstorm, sudden and unstoppable, how every slammed door, every broken plate, every red-faced accusation became a warning sign etched into her bones. Her mom had left one cold November morning, suitcase packed before sunrise, kissing Clara's forehead and whispering, "You're braver than you know. I'll come back for you." But the years passed, and Clara learned that bravery and hope weren't always enough to keep someone close. In the aftermath, Clara built her defenses from silence and small spaces, closets, corners, the hollow under the stairs. Words became dangerous. Attention was a spotlight she shrank from. Lydia, her aunt, had taken her in with an open door and gentle rules, never pressing for details. Even now, Clara sometimes flinched at sudden movements, or startled awake from dreams she'd never share. When other kids at school laughed about nothing, Clara watched from the edge, hands in her pockets, wishing she could feel as safe as they looked. It was that silent armor that drew her to midnight. As days turned into weeks, their routines began to mirror each other's wounds, both wary, both unbroken, yet bent by things no one else could see. Midnight still bolted from any hand but Clara's. Even Lydia, trying to be gentle, couldn't get near him without the stallion's eyes going wild, body tense to flee. If a car backfired on the road, he'd rear and race the length of the pasture, sweat darkening his hide. Clara saw herself in every jitter and panic. Sometimes she wondered if healing was ever truly possible, or if it was just learning to live with scars and find moments of calm between the storms. She poured these questions into the music she played for midnight. Her flute's songs carried longing and loneliness, little bits of herself that felt too heavy for words. She read about horses and trauma in every book she could find. One library paperback spoke of mirroring, how abused animals sometimes copy the behaviors and moods of those around them, just as Clara had mirrored her father's anger or her mother's quiet despair. The more she watched Midnight, the more she understood. They weren't just healing together, they were reflecting each other's pain, slowly untangling the knots. Some evenings, after chores were done, Clara would walk the perimeter of the field as Midnight grazed. She talked in a low voice, telling him pieces of her story she'd never told anyone else, not even Lydia. But with Midnight, it felt natural. "People say you're dangerous," she whispered, leaning on the fence as fireflies lit up the grass. "They said that about me too once. Said I was too quiet, too strange. I guess people are scared of what they can't fix." It was on one of those evenings that everything shifted. The sun was melting behind the hills, painting the sky gold and lavender. Clara sat cross-legged in the field's high grass, flute resting in her lap. Midnight wandered close, drawn by the familiar ritual. Clara began to play, the melody slow and mournful. She let her thoughts drift back to the last night her mom was home. The way the kitchen light flickered, the smell of rain on concrete. Midnight, uncharacteristically calm, circled and settled behind her. The music drifted, Clara's eyes half closed. And then, quietly, almost as if asking permission, Midnight lowered his massive head and rested it gently across her back. The warmth of his breath tickled her shoulder. Clara froze, startled, not by fear, but by the shocking intimacy of the gesture. It felt as if the whole world held its breath. She stopped playing, hands trembling. The horse didn't move, just pressed his weight softly against her. A silent offering. Clara let out a long, shaky exhale and dared to reach back, fingers brushing the edge of Midnight's muzzle. He did not flinch. For the first time, she realized how much trust had grown between them, layered day after day, song after song, small moment after small moment. In that perfect stillness, the memories did not vanish, but they loosened their grip. She thought of all the times she'd sat in silence, hiding from anger, wishing for someone who could simply be with her. No questions, no demands. Here, with Midnight, she found that. No explanations, no expectations, just shared presence. The past was still there, but it no longer held all the power. The next morning, Lydia found Clara asleep in the field, Midnight standing guard above her, both of them at peace. Lydia shook her head, a small smile touching her lips. "That horse trusts you, honey," she murmured. "Maybe more than he trusts himself." Days slipped by with small victories. Midnight began to let Clara touch his mane, to accept treats from her palm. The scars beneath his coat seemed less raw. Clara's own scars, those invisible, aching places, also began to heal. She didn't jump as much at loud noises. She could laugh a little louder, talk a little longer at dinner. Lydia noticed, though she never made a big deal of it, just slid an extra biscuit onto Clara's plate or left the porch light burning a little later each night. But the world outside the farm kept turning, At school, Clara's new confidence drew stares and whispers. Some kids poked fun. "Hey, horse whisperer, got any tips for my dog?" Ugh. But others watched with curiosity, as if Clara's quiet power had become something worth admiring instead of fearing. Yet, healing is never a straight line. There were bad days, when old memories surged, and midnight spooked at things no one else could see. Once, when a storm rolled in, Midnight panicked, rearing and galloping wildly until he slipped in the mud and skinned his leg. Clara ran to him, not with rope or commands, but with her flute and her voice, staying with him in the rain until he calmed. She learned that some wounds never go away. Her mom never came back. Her father's shadow stretched long, but in the golden hours before dusk, when Midnight's head rested on her back and their breathing fell into the same rhythm, Clara understood that survival wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making peace with it, one gentle moment at a time. Summer stretched over Silver Ridge, turning fields brittle and air heavy with the scent of cut hay. At the Monroe farm, Clara's days began to find a rhythm, a kind of quiet miracle after years spent surviving on unpredictability. Her bond with Midnight deepened. She read to him in the afternoons, played her flute at sunset, and found herself smiling more often, even when she was alone. But peace, as Clara was learning, was never something you could count on staying. It was always one loud voice, one bad day, or one shadow away from shattering. And this time, the shadow had a name: Wendell Cross. The first time Clara heard about Wendell Cross was from the feed store clerk, a man who never missed a scrap of local gossip. "Heard Cross is fuming," he told Aunt Lydia, voice low and gleeful. "That stallion made him look like a fool at the auction. Man's not used to being shown up by a little girl and a broken horse." Lydia only shook her head, lips pursed. Cross never cared about the horses, only his image. She didn't say more, but Clara heard the warning in her tone. Wendell Cross was something of a legend in the county. He'd built his reputation on flash and noise, a rodeo stockman whose boots cost more than Clara's aunt's truck. He was broad-shouldered, loud, and always quick with a story about some untamable beast he'd conquered with his bare hands. His face was in the local papers every time the fair rolled through, always grinning under a white cowboy hat, always promising to show the crowd how real horsemen get it done. It was only a matter of time before Cross decided to reclaim his spotlight. Rumors swirled faster than summer flies. Cross was planning to buy the meanest bronco he could find and stage a public training at the upcoming county fair. The plan, as folks whispered, was to make sure nobody remembered the day Clara Monroe and her flute stole the show. Oh, Cross wanted the world to know that only men like him, loud, hard, unyielding, knew how to handle dangerous animals. The news unsettled Clara. She pretended not to care at first, focusing on Midnight and her small routines. But the talk kept following her. To school, to the diner where she picked up groceries for Lydia, even to church on Sunday mornings. "You gonna watch Cross break that new bronco? Hey, but he's out for revenge after what happened at the auction. Think he's gunning for your horse, Clara?" The question stung. She didn't have answers. Lydia tried to shield her from the worst of it, but Clara could see her aunt's worry deepening. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Lydia told her, pouring coffee at the kitchen table one night. "Let Cross have his show. You just take care of your own." But Clara knew it wasn't so simple. There were kids at school who looked up to Cross, who thought the only way to earn respect was through fear and brute strength. Clara had lived her whole life in the shadow of that logic. She'd seen what happened to gentle things left unprotected. She'd been one herself. The rumors became reality the day a battered trailer rumbled into town, carrying a new arrival, Brutus. Brutus was a bronco the color of old rust, eyes wild, muscles twitching under a battered hide. Even through the slats of the trailer, Clara could see the tension winding through his body, the scars that mapped his life. Cross strutted around the animal, boots clinking with silver spurs, a crowd gathering to watch. Clara saw the way Cross yanked Brutus's rope, The way he barked commands and slapped the horse's flank with a riding crop. You have to show 'em who's boss, he boomed to the onlookers, and the crowd, hungry for a spectacle, cheered him on. It was a performance built on dominance, not understanding. Brutus's nostrils flared, he reared and jerked, but Cross only laughed, spurs flashing. Clara stood back, arms folded, heart pounding with something that was not quite fear and not quite rage. She wanted to shout at the crowd, to tell them they were watching cruelty disguised as tradition, but her words stuck in her throat. She glanced at Midnight, who stood by the fence, muscles tense but eyes fixed on the bronco. He knew what it was to be paraded, judged, and punished for failing to perform. As the fair drew closer, the tension on the Monroe farm grew thick. Lydia worried about Clara getting dragged into Cross's drama. "Just promise me you'll keep your distance," she begged one night. "Men like him, he doesn't care about right or wrong, just pride." But Clara couldn't promise. She felt a responsibility she couldn't name, a need to stand up for more than just herself and Midnight. She remembered the silence that followed her mother's absence, the bruises her father left behind, the way her whole world had shrunk to hiding and hoping. She remembered how powerless she had felt, and child, she was determined never to feel that way again. Whispers began to swirl around Clara at school. "You going to the fair? Bet Cross wants a rematch. Aren't you scared?" Sometimes she was, but every evening when she stood in the field with Midnight, his scars softening under her touch, her fear shrank a little more. She played her flute not just for him, but for herself, notes carrying her courage out into the world, one trembling breath at a time. One afternoon, as Clara led Midnight along the creek, she overheard two ranch hands talking near the road. "Cross is bringing in press for this. Wants to make sure everyone sees the real way to break a horse." "Yeah, well, after that flute girl made him look weak, can you blame him?" Clara's cheeks burned. She wasn't looking for attention. She wanted healing, not headlines, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that she and Midnight were being challenged in a contest she never asked for. Back at home, Lydia handed Clara a letter from the county fair board, an invitation, formal and polite, to bring Midnight and demonstrate her unique approach to horsemanship. Clara's hands shook as she read. The crowd would be bigger than at the auction. Cross would be there, with Brutus and his angry, jeering supporters. The choice was hers. That night, Clara sat in the barn, long after Lydia went to bed, stroking Midnight's mane as he nuzzled her shoulder. She whispered, "I don't know if I'm brave enough for this." Midnight nudged her gently, his breath warm against her cheek. In his eyes, she saw not expectation, but trust. The same fragile, hard-won trust they had built together. She lifted her flute and played, letting the music drift out into the night, a promise to herself and to every soul who'd ever been broken and overlooked. It was not a song of victory. It was a song of survival, a quiet stand against every man who'd ever tried to prove strength with fear. Outside, a breeze swept across the fields, carrying her music far beyond the fence line, out to where even Wendell Cross might someday hear it and know he'd been challenged by something he could never break. The county fair arrived like a thunderclap, waking Silver Ridge from its lazy summer trance. For days before, the town buzzed with anticipation. Banners flapped from telephone poles, food trucks set up near the ball field, and bright lights rose above the fairground on the edge of town, promising spectacle and excitement. But beneath the carnival music and laughter, there was a different kind of energy. Something restless, thick with expectation and the electric charge of competition. Clara could feel it in the pit of her stomach as she loaded Midnight into the trailer that morning. The sky was a pale blue, the kind that hides its heat until you're sweating through your shirt by noon. Aunt Lydia moved with a nervousness she tried to hide, double-checking the trailer doors, counting the bales of hay, packing extra apples. Clara caught her aunt's hand before they left. "We'll be all right," she promised, her voice steady, even if her hands weren't. Lydia squeezed her fingers. "Just remember, you don't owe anybody a show. You do what feels right." "That's all." Clara nodded, heart pounding. As they pulled into the fairground, Clara saw the chaos unfolding. Trailers lined the fence in crooked rows. Kids darted between them, waving cotton candy, while ranchers and trainers moved in packs, barking orders, and boasting about their stock. Horses whinnied, cows lowed, and every few minutes a burst of laughter or the blare of an announcer's voice would ripple through the morning air. But at the center of it all, drawing a crowd before the gates even opened, was Wendell Cross and his new bronco, Brutus. The sight of them made Clara's heart twist. Brutus was huge, much bigger than Midnight. His copper coat streaked with sweat and his eyes rolling white with terror. His muscles quivered, ears pinned flat. Even standing still, the horse seemed to vibrate with contained panic. Cross, as always, played to his audience. His boots shone, spurs jangling with every step. He barked orders at two young ranch hands struggling to keep hold of Brutus's halter. "He just needs a real man to show him who's boss," Cross shouted, and the crowd of onlookers, mostly men in dusty hats and work shirts, laughed and hollered their approval. Brutus jerked hard, nearly knocking one boy off his feet. Sweat foamed on the bronco's neck, flecks of white flying with every toss of his head. Clara watched from behind the fence, Midnight standing quietly at her side. She could feel the tension in her horse, the way his body tensed whenever Brutus screamed or Cross's voice rose above the crowd. It made her skin prickle. She put a hand on Midnight's shoulder, letting her calm seep through her fingertips. Aunt Lydia was watching too, concern etched deep into her face. "That horse is scared out of his mind," she muttered. "And Cross is only making it worse." Clara nodded. She knew fear when she saw it. She'd lived it, had seen it in her own reflection, in the faces of animals and people who'd been pushed too far. She thought about what Cross was teaching every kid who watched him, and it filled her with a quiet, growing anger. They set up near the back edge of the grounds, under a cluster of cottonwood trees that offered some shade. Midnight stepped carefully out of the trailer, head high, nostrils flaring at the strange smells: fried dough, engine oil, sweat, and sawdust. Clara set up a small pen with portable fencing, spreading out hay and fresh water. She gave Midnight a moment to settle, then fetched her flute, running her thumb over the worn silver, grounding herself in the familiar. A crowd streamed past all day, curious children, old women with lawn chairs, reporters with cameras dangling from their necks. Some recognized Clara from the auction, calling out, "Hey, flute girl, you going up against Cross today?" Others just gawked at Midnight, whispering about the killer stallion and daring each other to get closer. Clara ignored the attention. She focused on keeping Midnight calm, walking him in slow circles, humming under her breath. Every so often, she'd catch sight of Brutus, still trapped in his own pen, still trembling. Cross's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, promising a lesson in real horsemanship at the main arena that afternoon. Time passed in a blur of color and sound. Clara tried to tune it out, the shouting, the rides, the music, until the moment came. She and Lydia walked Midnight toward the main arena, weaving through crowds who made way for the black stallion. Up close, the energy was sharper, charged with expectation. People pressed against the rails, jostling for a better view. Cross was already in the ring, standing tall, waving his hat. Brutus pawed the dirt, foam flecking his mouth, sides heaving. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cross bellowed, "you're about to see how a real cowboy handles a challenge." The announcer hyped up the crowd, voices bouncing off the bleachers. Lydia squeezed Clara's arm. "Remember, you don't have to do anything you don't want to. We can walk away." But Clara just shook her head, jaw set. "If I don't show people there's another way, who will?" As the demonstration began, the atmosphere grew electric. Cross strutted, cracking his whip for effect. Brutus reared, screaming. The crowd cheered, some flinching as the bronco slammed into the rails. Even the announcer sounded uneasy. "Looks like Brutus is giving Mr. Cross a real run for his money, folks." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She kept Midnight back, far enough from the chaos, but close enough to see everything. Her hands trembled, but she didn't back away. Cross tried everything: ropes, whips, brute force. Brutus only grew more panicked, charging the fence, eyes rolling, foam dripping from his mouth. A hush fell over the crowd as the horse bucked so hard one of the handlers was nearly trampled. For a moment, Clara saw herself in that arena, small, afraid, desperate for escape. She remembered every time she'd been told to be tough, to get over it, to stop crying. The tension was unbearable. Aunt Lydia leaned in. "I don't like where this is going," she whispered. Clara just nodded, her eyes never leaving Brutus. She could sense something was about to snap. She glanced at Midnight, who pawed the dirt nervously, ears flicking, muscles coiled tight. She reached out, stroking his mane, grounding herself. Then, with a suddenness that made the crowd gasp, Brutus broke free. The bronco tore through a gap in the fencing, wild with terror. He bolted toward the fair's main gate, scattering people in every direction. Shouts and screams rang out. In the chaos, a small child tripped and fell, directly in Brutus's path. Clara's breath caught. The world seemed to slow as fear and adrenaline rushed through her veins. She looked at Midnight, his eyes wide, muscles tense, nostrils flaring. Without thinking, Clara moved, already planning her next action. The crowd watched, helpless, as disaster raced toward them. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. And somewhere, underneath the panic and noise, Clara knew that everything was about to change. For a split second, everything at the county fair seemed to freeze, Brutus's hooves pounding the packed dirt, the stunned faces of the crowd, the piercing scream of a mother as her child fell in the path of the rampaging bronco. In the bleachers, people stood up, clutching the rails, hands flying to mouths. The moment was raw, urgent, the line between disaster and miracle stretching thin. Clara didn't think. She just acted. As Brutus barreled straight for the gate, the world around her tunneled to that single point. The child lying motionless in the dirt, the wild horse bearing down. Clara's body moved before her mind could catch up. She grabbed Midnight's halter, meeting his startled, questioning eyes. There was no time for second-guessing, no time for fear. She pulled open the trailer door. Midnight hesitated, sensing the energy, his muscles taut as steel cables. Clara reached up, pressing her forehead to his, whispering a single word. "Please?" Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady, even as chaos erupted around them. "We have to help, Midnight. I know you're scared, but I need you now." For a heartbeat, it seemed impossible. Midnight was a survivor, not a hero. He'd spent his life running from pain, not toward danger. But in Clara's touch, he found something he hadn't known before, trust that ran deeper than fear. He snorted, shaking his mane, and then, as if understanding, he stepped forward, hooves thudding onto the ramp, into the noise and madness of the fairground. The crowd parted, unsure of what they were seeing. Clara, small but unyielding, strode beside her horse, holding his halter loose but confident. She walked quickly, weaving between panicked fairgoers, the sound of Brutus's rampage growing louder with every stride. Ahead, Brutus veered, nostrils flaring, foam flying from his mouth. His terror had become rage, a storm with no direction. Clara knew she couldn't stop him by force. She fumbled for her flute, hands shaking, and raised it to her lips. She closed her eyes, blocking out the world, letting her breath flow through the instrument. A simple melody floated out. Sweet, strong, a song she'd played for Midnight every lonely night since she'd found him. The notes cut through the noise, a strand of calm in the chaos. Midnight's ears pricked forward. He surged ahead, Clara running at his side, the music guiding them like a beacon. Brutus slowed, his ears flicking, uncertain. The sound of the flute caught him, made him hesitate. The child, frozen with fear, stared up at the monstrous animal, unable to move. Clara didn't break stride. She dropped to her knees in the dirt, just feet from the child, her music unwavering. Midnight wheeled in front of Brutus, planting himself like a wall, massive and black, every muscle tight, but his gaze calm and steady. He snorted, holding his ground as Brutus, trembling, slid to a stop, confusion flickering through his wild eyes. The crowd was silent now, thousands of eyes locked on the ring, watching a moment none of them would ever forget. Clara kept playing, every note a promise. You are not alone. You are safe. Brutus stomped, head tossing, sides heaving. He pawed the ground, torn between fear and curiosity, violence and exhaustion. Midnight held his position, flanking Clara and the child, breathing heavily but unmoving, the anchor in the eye of the storm. Clara shifted, lowering her flute for a breath. She reached out with one hand, speaking softly, her voice barely above a whisper, but carried by the stunned silence. "Easy, Brutus. You're okay. No one's gonna hurt you here." Midnight stepped closer to Brutus, their noses nearly touching. The stallion snorted softly, his body language open, unafraid, inviting. Brutus's wildness faded a little, his head drooping. The world seemed to hold its breath as the two horses, one scarred by men, the other by his own terror, stood together. With her other hand, Clara gently helped the child to his feet, never taking her eyes off the horses. The boy stumbled, wide-eyed, clutching her arm. Clara guided him back toward his mother, who sobbed with relief, gathering her child in a desperate hug. The spell broke. Clara sat down in the dirt, chest heaving, her knees shaking with delayed fear. She put the flute back to her lips, playing a soft, soothing melody that washed over the arena. Midnight lowered his head, exhaling, standing guard beside her. Brutus stood, breathing hard, but he didn't run. The fairgrounds fell into an awed silence. No laughter, no jeers, only the fragile, haunting sound of music and the heavy breathing of horses. Reporters, quick to recover, surged forward, cameras clicking. Spectators crowded the rails, whispering. On the far side of the ring, Wendell-Cross pushed through the crowd, his face flushed, jaw clenched. He looked at Brutus, then at Midnight, then at Clara, his plans for dominance unraveling before the eyes of the whole county. The announcer's voice finally broke through, shaky and uncertain. "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we've ever seen anything like this at Silver Ridge." Clara stayed on the ground, flute in her lap, the dust settling around her. Midnight stood guard, head high, proud and protective. Brutus, calmer now, stood quietly beside him, the storm inside him finally stilled. Lydia pushed through the crowd, dropping to her knees beside Clara, arms wrapping her in a fierce hug. "You did it," she whispered, tears streaking her face. "You and Midnight? You saved them?" But Clara shook her head. She looked at Midnight, at Brutus, at the stunned faces around her. "We just listened," she said quietly. "We made space for them to be heard." And in that moment, with the sun setting in bands of gold and fire beyond the fairgrounds, Clara understood that courage was not the absence of fear. It was choosing to act in spite of it, to trust, to reach out, to give space for healing, even when the world demanded something harder and louder. The crowd, moved beyond words, slowly began to applaud. First a handful, then dozens, then hundreds, an ovation that echoed over the fields. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she stood, brushing dust from her jeans. Midnight pressed close at her side, and as dusk fell over Silver Ridge, the story of the flute girl and her black stallion began to spread, not as a tale of conquest or spectacle, but as a living memory of what can happen when kindness stands up to chaos, and a broken voice finds the courage to sing. The chaos at the county fair faded into a kind of stunned quiet in the hours that followed. For the rest of the evening, Clara became the reluctant epicenter of attention, though she did everything she could to slip into the background. The people who had jeered her for being the flute girl now crowded around with questions, gratitude, even awe. But Clara wasn't interested in being a hero. She was too busy making sure Midnight was okay, brushing the dust from his coat and whispering thanks into his mane. Every so often, she'd glance over at Brutus, who stood in his pen, eyes softer, ears flicking toward the familiar notes Clara played as she packed up. Reporters, drawn by the whispers of what happened, swarmed the field with notebooks, cameras, and cell phones. One, a young woman with a ponytail and a sharp smile, thrust a microphone in Clara's face. "Clara! Clara Monroe! What were you thinking when you stepped out there?" Another called, "What does it feel like to be a hero?" Clara's answer was the same every time. "I wasn't thinking about anything except helping." She deflected the rest, keeping her answers short, her eyes drifting to midnight and away from the press. But even as Clara dodged the spotlight, the world was already changing around her. By nightfall, shaky cell phone videos, clips of a small girl kneeling in the dirt, flute raised, her black stallion shielding a child, were lighting up social media. The hashtags #FluteGirl and #MidnightMiracle trended by morning, and the story raced far beyond Silver Ridge. Clara's phone buzzed nonstop. Local news ran headlines, 12-year-old calms rampaging horses with music. By the next afternoon, a national network called Aunt Lydia's house for an exclusive interview. Lydia answered with her usual gentle steeliness, telling them Clara was busy with chores, and maybe the world could learn to wait. But the reporters kept coming. Some knocked on the farmhouse door before breakfast, others camped by the end of the lane, hoping to catch a glimpse of Clara and midnight. Aunt Lydia bristled at the invasion, but Clara did her best to ignore the commotion, finding solace in the old routines. Brushing Midnight's coat, reading by the fence, playing the same soft tunes at dusk. Still, the attention brought trouble. Wendell Cross, humiliated and desperate to salvage his reputation, gave his own interviews. "That girl just got lucky. You saw what happened. Those horses could have killed someone. You can't trust animals like that or children with no training." He dismissed Clara's approach as childish, a dangerous fluke. Some folks echoed his opinion, wary of anything that challenged the old ways. But most people felt something shift inside them. Neighbors stopped by, dropping off sacks of grain or handwritten notes of thanks. A local vet, Dr. Reese, drove out to the farm to meet Clara and some Midnight, offering his support and quiet admiration. "What you did was more than brave, Clara," he told her. "You reminded people what's possible when you meet fear with patience instead of force." Word spread, and soon it wasn't just reporters showing up at the Monroe farm. Horse owners from neighboring counties, and then from much farther away, started arriving, leading skittish animals up Clara's dirt driveway. Some had horses that bit or bolted, others with animals deemed hopeless cases. Each time Clara welcomed them quietly, never making promises she couldn't keep. She watched how the horses entered, nervous, eyes darting, hooves scraping the gravel. Some wouldn't leave their trailers at all, just like Midnight that first night. Clara understood the feeling. She remembered what it was to arrive somewhere new, carrying all your brokenness, not sure if anyone would ever let you be more than your worst day. So she gave them what she had learned: patience, stillness, gentle words, music. She didn't care about the cameras or the internet. She cared about what happened in the silence, when the last car left and the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the pasture in orange and gold. That's when the real work began. She played her flute by the fence, letting the melody drift over the grass, inviting the frightened horses to listen, to step forward if they wanted. Sometimes they did. Sometimes it took days. And people kept coming, not just for their animals, but for themselves. Some came with stories of their own, losses, scars, old griefs. One woman, her voice trembling, thanked Clara for reminding her that gentleness was still possible in a world that demanded toughness. A teenage boy came by, just to sit in the grass and listen, his own dog-eared copy of Black Beauty in his lap. But Clara never let it go to her head. She knew how fragile peace could be. She still had nights when the echoes from her past haunted her sleep. She still heard the old voices, her father's anger, her mother's goodbye. Some wounds didn't vanish, but they softened in the company of those who understood. Aunt Lydia, for her part, grew fiercely protective. She installed a new gate at the end of the driveway and told the press to respect their privacy or face her wrath. But in the quiet moments, Lydia would sit beside Clara in the barn, her rough hands steadying Clara's trembling ones, pride shining in her tired eyes. "You're doing good, honey, not just for the horses, but for everyone watching." The days passed, and with each one, Clara's confidence grew, not in the way of someone who sought the spotlight, but in the quiet certainty of a person who'd learned the hardest way that healing was possible. She started dreaming about something bigger than just helping a few lost animals. Maybe, she thought, there could be a place for all the misfits and the broken things, a place where patience, Music and stillness were stronger than fear. One evening, as Clara played her flute under the stars, midnight grazing close by, a little girl arrived with her father and a gray mare who trembled at every sound. The girl watched Clara with wide eyes, hope and worry mingling in her freckled face. Clara smiled, inviting her to sit, showing her how to let the music fill the space between them and the frightened horse. In that moment, Clara realized she was no longer alone. The barn was filling up, not just with animals, but with people looking for a gentler way, for proof that kindness could change the story. The world might call her the flute girl, but here, among the broken and the brave, Clara was becoming something else. A listener, a healer, a friend to the silent and the scared. And as darkness fell over the sanctuary she was building, Clara let her music rise. Soft and true, a quiet anthem for everyone learning to trust again. The days after the fair blended into a gentle golden rhythm on the Monroe farm. Summer's harshness softened into late afternoons, thick with the hum of cicadas and the laughter of neighbors drifting through open windows. For Clara, life no longer felt like a storm to survive, but a field slowly greening after drought. The crowds and the camera crews faded, but something more enduring took root, a sense of community, healing, and hope. It began with a trickle. The first few horses and their anxious owners returned, then more and more, until the old barn could barely contain the stories waiting to be rewritten. Aunt Lydia shook her head at the growing herd, but always managed to find extra bales of hay, old blankets, and the odd fence post to mend another broken paddock. She recruited the neighbor boys to help muck stalls and welcomed Dr. Reese's steady presence and practical wisdom. Clara moved through it all quietly, not seeking attention, her days a tapestry of new routines. In the early hours, she fed the horses, checked each one for fresh cuts or tender hooves, learning the shape of every worry in their eyes. At sunrise, she played her flute beside the paddock, her music floating over the dew-bright grass, inviting the wary and the wounded closer. Some responded right away, stepping forward with cautious hope. Others kept their distance for days, but Clara never rushed them. She remembered what it felt like to need space, to need time for the old hurts to lose their sting. Midnight became a constant presence in the fields, a silent guardian moving among the newcomers with a gentle power. He had changed too. The stallion, who once recoiled from every touch, now stood calmly beside the most frightened arrivals, matching his breath to theirs, sharing the steady peace he'd learned from Clara. When a new horse arrived, a trembling gelding named Rusty, all ribs and wide eyes, Midnight was the first to stand nearby, patient and still, until the gelding found the courage to graze. The transformation of the farm was gradual but undeniable. People started calling it Still Haven Sanctuary. It was a place without bits, without ropes or harsh words, where no animal was forced to do anything but exist, breathe, and heal. The sign Aunt Lydia painted and hung at the gate said it simply, no punishment, no pressure, only listening. Dr. Reese became a steady fixture, offering free checkups and advice. He brought along a couple of eager volunteers, high schoolers who loved animals and wanted to learn the Clara way. The little sanctuary grew into a hub of shared effort. The old barn was cleaned, new fences were built, and soon there was talk of adding another pasture, maybe even a round pen for quiet training. At first, Clara worried the attention might change things, that too many people might bring noise and chaos back to the quiet space she'd carved out of pain. But she learned that, like music, some things are strongest when shared. The horses settled, the volunteers found meaning in their simple tasks, and the people who arrived as strangers often left as friends. She watched as the sanctuary became more than a home for lost animals. It grew into a refuge for people who carried invisible scars, mothers and sons, battered husbands, lonely children. Each had their own story, their own reason for seeking out a place where gentleness was the rule, not the exception. Some stayed for an hour, others for days, lending a hand or simply sitting in the grass and listening to Clara's flute. Aunt Lydia, never one for sentiment, nonetheless seemed to soften too. She took to baking extra loaves of bread, slipping slices to volunteers on hot afternoons, and making sure every animal got a treat or a kind word. In the evenings, she and Clara would sit on the porch, listening to the quiet that now felt full of possibility, not fear. One night, as a summer thunderstorm rolled in, Clara found herself huddled in the barn with Midnight, Rusty, and a nervous chestnut mare named Willow. The rain drummed hard on the metal roof, but inside, the air was warm and safe. Clara played her flute, letting the music drift and soothe. Midnight stood beside her, calm and steady, Willow pressing close for comfort. In that moment, Clara realized how much her life had changed, not just from the applause at the fair, but from the steady work of earning trust, giving patience, and letting silence heal. She looked around the barn and saw Dr. Rees bandaging a colt's leg, a volunteer reading by lantern light, Lydia organizing tack. The faces and stories were different, but the sense of belonging, the feeling that here, finally, you could be exactly who you were, broken pieces and all, was the same for everyone. The sanctuary's reputation began to spread beyond the county. Letters arrived, handwritten and hopeful, from people who had seen the viral video or heard the story on the news. Some asked if Clara could help their horse, others simply thanked her for showing the world another way. Clara answered every letter, often late at night by candlelight, her handwriting neat and careful. She shared advice, encouragement, and sometimes just a line or two about patience and breathing and the way music could reach places words could not. But the most profound change was within Clara herself. She was no longer just the flute girl. She became a listener, a restorer, someone who could see the pain beneath anger, the hope beneath fear. She grew confident in her quietness, strong in her kindness. She learned to lead not with force, but with the power of presence and the conviction that gentleness was not weakness. Midnight, once a symbol of danger and brokenness, became the sanctuary's anchor. New arrivals found calm just by standing near him. Clara often joked that he was the true leader of Stillhaven. She'd sit in the shade, watching Midnight breathe with a skittish colt or stand guard over a sleeping mare, her heart swelling with pride. One afternoon, a mother arrived with her young son in a battered pony. The boy, frightened and silent, wouldn't let anyone near. Clara sat with him in the grass, playing her flute, telling him stories of Midnight and the early days, sharing her own fears and the ways she'd learned to cope. Little by little, the boy's hand reached for hers, and the pony, sensing safety, began to nibble grass at their feet. It was moments like these, not the media attention or the crowds, that meant the most to Clara. She understood now that healing wasn't a miracle. It was a slow, shared process, a willingness to show up, to listen, to believe that even the most shattered soul could find peace. As the sun set over Stillhaven, painting the fields in gold and rose, Clara stood with her hand resting on Midnight's strong neck. Around her, laughter and music, the sounds of horses and people coming alive again. She knew there would always be new arrivals, new stories, new sorrows, but she faced the future with hope. She raised her flute and played a melody for the night. Not a song of triumph, but of gratitude. For the chance to build something new, for the gift of trust, and for the quiet, stubborn miracle of a sanctuary that had healed not just horses, but her own heart. Silver Ridge's early autumn felt different that year. There was a shift in the air, a quiet recognition, like the first breeze that hints at changing leaves. The Monroe Farm, now called Stillhaven Sanctuary by everyone in town, thrived with gentle routine and shared purpose, but beyond its peaceful fences, old voices still echoed, unwilling to surrender the past. Wendell Cross was one of those voices. He couldn't let go of the humiliation he'd suffered at the county fair. The story of the flute girl had gone everywhere, making him the butt of jokes at the feed store and the saloon. To Cross, it was a challenge he couldn't ignore. If the world wouldn't remember him as the master horseman, then he'd force them to watch one more time. So he doubled down. Cross rented the biggest arena in the next county over and plastered flyers in every window. Discipline clinic, learn how real men handle wild stock. He promised fireworks, hard lessons, and a new horse to prove his way was best. Rumors swirled. He had bought a new Mustang, even meaner than Brutus, and he'd show the whole county that real authority meant fear. Clara heard about the clinic weeks in advance, but she tried not to let it weigh on her. Life at Stillhaven was too full. New arrivals nearly every week. Volunteers pitching in, even Dr. Reese shaking his head in awe at how quickly the place had grown. Aunt Lydia joked about needing a second barn, and the high schoolers built benches near the pasture so people could sit and watch the horses settle into peace. But it was impossible to escape Cross's shadow completely. Some of the sanctuary's visitors were curious, asking, "Aren't you going to stand up to him?" Others, older and wary, worried that Cross would bring trouble to Clara's quiet haven. Lydia grumbled, "Let the man yell himself hoarse. We have real work to do." Clara nodded, but inside she felt a slow, rising unease, a tug in her chest she couldn't ignore. When the day of Cross's clinic arrived, Silver Ridge buzzed with talk. Trucks and trailers headed for the big arena. Crowds followed the spectacle, hungry for something to believe in. Cross, dressed in starched denim and new boots, strutted before the cameras, bullhorn in hand, promising to show these soft-hearted folks how it's really done. The air inside the arena was tense. Loud music, the clang of metal gates, the crack of whips. Every demonstration started with bluster and shouting. But as the day wore on, the showmanship couldn't hide the truth. The Mustang Cross brought, wild-eyed, lathered with sweat, refused to bend. He bucked and kicked, eyes rolling, terror leaking from every movement. Cross barked orders, yanked ropes, even waved a whip for the crowd. Some cheered, but others grew silent, shifting in their seats, uncomfortable with the violence. It was clear to many that fear only bred more fear. Meanwhile, Clara's sanctuary held its own kind of gathering. People came from miles away, some bringing horses, others just hoping to see the girl with the flute and the black stallion. The mood at Stillhaven was the opposite of Cross's arena. Soft words, laughter, the gentle shuffle of hooves, and the sound of Clara's flute rising through the afternoon. Volunteers led new arrivals into sunlit paddocks, introducing them not with ropes, but with kindness and patience. That same afternoon, as Cross's discipline clinic played out in chaos and shouting, Clara sat cross-legged in the field with a rescued mare named Sweet Pea, her hand open and patient, letting the horse approach on her own time. Nearby, Midnight grazed, his presence alone enough to calm the other animals. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of Cross's distant loudspeaker, but Clara paid it no mind. Her sanctuary was a living answer to every angry boast he could make. And then, in a twist nobody expected, Brutus returned. He arrived in a weathered trailer, guided by a gentle-eyed woman named Mrs. Calloway. Clara recognized the horse immediately. The copper coat, the scar above his eye, the wary look that had once spelled nothing but trouble. But Brutus had changed. His eyes, once wild and haunted, now softened when they landed on Midnight, who trotted to greet him. Mrs. Calloway explained, "He was too much for anyone. Nobody wanted to try after what happened at the fair. But then I heard about you and your way. I thought maybe Brutus could find peace here." Clara smiled, brushing her hand down Brutus's neck. "He already looks lighter, like he remembers what it's like to trust." Brutus settled quickly at Stillhaven. He became an unlikely favorite, gentle with foals and kind to new arrivals. Always close to Midnight, his old adversary turned friend. It was living proof that horses and people could change when given time and understanding. Word spread fast. Videos of Brutus calmly walking beside Clara and Midnight went up on social media. The same people who'd once cheered for Cross now shared the images with awe. "Look at Brutus now," they said. "Look at what Patience did." Back at Cross's clinic, the final demonstration ended in disaster. The Mustang broke loose, crashing through the ring, Cross shouting curses as handlers chased the animal down. The crowd, unsettled, left early, many shaking their heads. Some reporters packed their gear and drove straight to Stillhaven, eager for a different story. In the days that followed, the difference was impossible to ignore. The community's attention shifted People stopped talking about Cross's methods and started asking Clara about her approach, about listening, about healing, about how to see pain instead of just controlling it. Cross tried to stage a comeback, giving interviews, posting rants online, but the world had changed. He was yesterday's noise. At the feed store, people smiled politely but turned away. His name faded from headlines, replaced by stories of the sanctuary and its miracles. One afternoon, a truck passed by the Monroe farm and kept driving, dust curling in its wake. Lydia watched from the porch, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "Some folks just don't know when to quit," she said, but the sting in her words was gone. Clara didn't celebrate her rival's downfall. She was too busy, mucking stalls, leading another trembling horse into the sunlight, teaching new volunteers how to breathe deep and wait. She felt gratitude, not for Cross's failure, but for the chance to show there was a different way. A way built not on fear, but on presence and trust. Late one evening, as dusk gathered, Clara stood in the pasture, watching Brutus and Midnight side by side. Heads bent low, breathing together in the fading light. The sky turned lavender and gold, painting everything in softness. Clara played her flute, the music winding around her friends, horse and human alike. Around her, the sounds of Stillhaven, laughter, quiet words, gentle hoofbeats, wove a song of their own. It wasn't about glory or victory or even healing what was broken. It was about living with open hands, about choosing every day to trust, to listen, to create the kind of peace the world had told her was impossible. And as the stars winked on, Clara knew she'd risen far above the old shadows, carrying everyone who needed her, along with her, into the light. Rain fell soft and steady over Stillhaven Sanctuary, the late autumn night awash in silver mist. Clara stood beneath the eaves of the old barn, watching the patterns of droplets on the muddy yard, listening to the gentle tap of rain on tin. It was a night that would have made her nervous once, a night for bad memories to creep in. But tonight, there was a sense of quiet anticipation instead, as if something new was waiting just beyond the barn doors. Inside, the sanctuary was alive with warmth. Lanterns cast pools of gold across the floorboards. Horses shuffled inside in their stalls, content. Midnight dozed in the straw, the steady rise and fall of his breath, a comfort to everyone around him. Brutus, now the gentlest soul in the barn, stood watch near the door, nose pressed against the chill air. Clara busied herself preparing for the evening. She folded a thick wool blanket and laid it in the corner of an empty stall, smoothing it with careful hands. Aunt Lydia peeked in from the tack room, her hair a wild gray halo in the lamplight. "You expecting company?" she teased, but there was a knowing look in her eye. Before Clara could answer, headlights swept across the yard, and a battered truck rolled through the rain, pulling a small trailer behind. A man stepped out, bundled in a worn, oilskin coat, leading a skinny, mud-streaked colt that shivered with every step. The colt's ribs showed through its rough coat. Its eyes were wide and wild, nostrils flaring as it searched for escape. Clara stepped into the rain, calm and unhurried. The man's voice was tight with worry. "Found him, wandering by the old highway. Looks like he's been running for days. Couldn't get near him till now. Thought maybe you... Well, you've got the touch, everyone says." Clara didn't promise anything. She simply nodded, speaking softly to the colt as she guided him through the open barn door. The storm outside grew fiercer, wind rattling the tin roof, thunder muttering along the ridge. The colt bolted at every new sound, eyes rolling, legs stiff with fear. She led him into the empty stall, spreading the blanket over the straw, and closed the gate with the gentlest click. She backed away, giving him room, then crouched in the opposite corner, not moving, not speaking. She waited, letting the quiet fill the space between them. Midnight watched from his stall, dark eyes wise and patient. After a moment he lay down in the straw, stretching out with a contented sigh. The colt's ears flicked, muscles trembling, but Clara saw the flicker of curiosity behind the fear. She pulled her flute from her jacket pocket, letting the rain and thunder become part of the music in her mind. Her breath was slow and even as she played, not a tune meant to tame, but a melody for stillness, for trust. The notes floated up, soft and searching, weaving through the barn like the scent of new hay. The colt's trembling slowed. He didn't bolt or rear. Instead, he watched Clara, then Midnight, and then the door, as if measuring the safety of each. Slowly, cautiously, he sank down to his knees on the blanket, nose still tucked tight to his chest. Clara didn't move. She kept playing, the song as gentle as rain on a window. Midnight rolled onto his side, closing his eyes, and the colt edged closer, inch by inch, until he lay with his flank pressed to the big black stallion's side. The barn grew quieter still, every creature attuned to the miracle unfolding in the lamplight. Aunt Lydia watched from the doorway, tears shining in her eyes. Dr. Reese, who had come to check on an old injury, stood beside her, shaking his head in wonder. She never raised a hand, he whispered. She just made space. And somehow, that was enough. The storm outside softened, the last rumbles of thunder rolling away over the hills. Clara set down her flute, voice carrying gentle in the hush. Some healing doesn't need fences. Sometimes it just needs someone willing to listen. She rose and left the stall quietly, letting the colt sleep in peace. Midnight stayed with him, breathing slow and deep, a living promise that trust could be shared. In the days that followed, the colt began to change. He would shy away, at loud noises or sudden movements, but he never ran far. When Clara entered the barn, he watched her with cautious hope. Each day, she would sit on the blanket and play her flute, never reaching, never forcing. Sometimes she read aloud. Poems, old stories, words meant to comfort and connect. Bit by bit, the colt grew braver, venturing closer, nosing at her sleeve, then her hair, then her hand. The sanctuary flourished with each new arrival. People and horses came seeking solace, understanding, a chance to start over. The volunteers became family, helping with chores, sharing meals, telling stories late into the night. Aunt Lydia and Dr. Reese worked side by side, laughter and wisdom filling every corner. Clara continued to learn. She read books about trauma and healing, wrote letters to other sanctuaries, shared her story when asked. She didn't pretend to have all the answers. Sometimes she was still the girl hiding in the shadows, afraid of raising her voice. But more often, she found herself standing tall, leading with gentleness, choosing patience over pride. Brutus became the colt's protector, showing him how to trust, how to play, how to rest in the quiet. Other horses who'd once been deemed dangerous or worthless flourished under the care of Stillhaven, their stories rewritten with every soft word and gentle hand. The reputation of the sanctuary grew. People sent donations, supplies, letters of gratitude. Some traveled for days to witness the quiet miracle for themselves. The media attention faded, but the lesson endured. A whisper passed from family to family, neighbor to neighbor. Healing was possible, and it didn't require fences or force. On the first frost-bright morning of winter, Clara woke early and found the colt standing at the gate, waiting for her. She reached out, palm open, breath steady. The colt pressed his nose into her hand, and for the first time, he let her lead him out into the sunlit field. Clara looked around at the horses, the barn, the people who'd become her family, and felt something settle inside her, a peace she had never known before. She knew there would be new challenges, new storms, but she also knew the truth she had learned from Midnight, from Brutus, from every animal and person who'd ever come to Stillhaven. Sometimes, making space for others to be seen, to be heard, to heal at their own pace, was the bravest thing anyone could do. As the day began, Clara stood in the pasture, flute in hand, and played a melody for the world beyond the sanctuary's fences, a call to anyone listening, anyone in need of hope. Her voiceover lingered in the stillness, reaching whoever might need it. She never raised a hand, She just made space. And somehow, that was enough. Some healing doesn't need fences. If this story reached you, share it. Someone out there is still learning how to listen. And with that, Still Haven Sanctuary continued to welcome the lost and the longing, its lessons spreading as softly and surely as music in the night.